fantastic book on the origins of World War One, which I now have.
Oh,
That's very nice. Did you write it yourself?
quite right too.
That's very sweet. Thank you.
Jane Hewitt. There we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this latest UK and a Changing Europe lunch hour. Today, we're turning our attention to matters international. What's been going on since the start of the Trump presidency, and more specifically, what it might mean for the UK. Got a fantastic panel, three of my favourite people on the panel. Rana Mitter, I can't get used to saying Rana Mitter of Harvard, but Rana Mitter of the Kennedy Centre, Harvard University, Margaret Macmillan, Emeritus Professor at the University of Oxford, and Tim Gartnash, also at the University of Oxford. Thank you all for finding the time. Rana's in Boston, Margaret's in Uruguay. Tim, I assume you're in Oxford.
I'm in Oxford.
Excellent. Okay, so we're truly global today. And just to kick us off, and as ever, put your questions in the Slido and vote for the ones you want me to put to the panel, because there are usually too many for me to get through all of them. Just to kick you off, I mean, it's a massive question, but I think we should start with this. Each of you in turn. I'll start with you, Margaret. What have you made of the first few weeks of the Trump presidency?
It's much crazier than I thought it would be. I think we anticipated that he would do some of what he said and that he was surrounded by people who had very clear, if conflicting agendas. But I think, I don't know how many people I speak for, but I'm completely stunned by the speed with which he's done it. And the power that he's given to Elon Musk is absolutely extraordinary. And the damage he's doing, I mean, every day brings a fresh sort of challenge, and what he's doing to his allies, what he's doing to his opponents. I find it absolutely terrifying, and I'm running out of adjectives.
Rana, I mean, in a sense, we haven't heard as much about China as we might have thought, have we?
I think that's exactly right, Anand. It's the missing element. China was talked about over and over again. There was going to be a 60% tariff on all the goods coming in from China. There was going to be a big push back against China. Actually, there's been, I think, really very little discussion about China overall. The one thing that has happened is this 10% tariff on goods. But to be honest, a 10% tariff is one of those things that seems to be almost neither here nor there. It's clearly not 60%. But it is enough to actually cause quite a lot of problems for a lot of American small businesses, which import parts and components from China. And at the moment, it looks like they're feeling the impact of that rather more than the Chinese suppliers themselves are. So it's certainly an annoyance for the Chinese. But I would say the fact they've reacted quite mildly, they've reported America to the WTO, but I think both sides know that that's unlikely to lead to any great investigation. They've also said they'll do an investigation into Google, which, as I'm sure people know, doesn't actually operate in China. So that's not going to get them much change, I think. So yes, overall, I wonder whether this means that when the Middle East and Ukraine have been dealt with one way or another, and I'll leave it to my distinguished colleagues to say what that might mean, whether this actually means that President Trump is getting in touch with President Xi and deciding that maybe some kind of big conversation about East Asia is needed. But what the contents of that might be, I think we still have to wait and see.
Thanks, Rana. Tim, you want to take up where Rana left off on Ukraine?
I would say I'm shaken, but also a bit stirred. So shaken because, as Margaret said, it's even worse than we expected, both in the attack on the constitutional order inside the United States and internationally, where we see him, I think, in ways we hadn't altogether expected, really bullying his friends and being soft on our enemies, right? So it's bullying Canada and Mexico and Denmark and now Europe over Ukraine, not to mention Ukraine itself, being rather soft on China, as Rana said, but spectacularly soft on Vladimir Putin and Russia. I mean, comparisons with Munich and appeasement are much overused, but in this case, I think it's really justified. And that puts Europe in a very difficult place. Now, when I say stirred, because I think we are actually seeing the beginnings of a European response at the Munich Security Conference to the double impact of Putin and Trump. We might talk about where that will go, but at least, there is some sense that if Europe doesn't get its act together now, when will it?
Okay, we'll come back to what Europe needs to do and whether Europe will do it. But I mean, is it hyperbolic to talk in terms of recent events being epoch defining or epoch changing? There's a lot of that language around, and I just want to get your sense. I mean, you're all renowned historians, so you can bring a sense of perspective to this. Are we changing epoch? Is this something absolutely fundamental that's shifting in world politics?
Do you want me to go?
Any of you?
Yeah,
Any of you?
okay. Well, at least there's one person who has been saying this for quite some time, and he's called Xi Jinping. And he uses a phrase and has used really since about 2017. I'll specify that date for you in a moment as to why that is. That there have been changes going on in the world that have not been seen for 2017, because of course that was the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, which was clearly an epoch-changing moment in its own right, not the only one, but clearly a very important one. And so, in a sense, that triggered that wider thought that actually changes were on the move again. I think that from China's point of view, and when I say China's point of view, I'm talking about not only official statements, but the way in which, when you monitor Chinese social media right now and see what people are saying about the world situation, that in a weird way, they find it rather one that's rather full of possibilities. In other words, that they perceive the world changing very fast, that Trump is something very different. He is not someone who will uphold the old order, but actually someone who wants to change it. And that gives China the chance, for instance, when it comes to the United Nations, when it comes to the World Economic Order, where China, with the Belt and Road Initiative, has already been making huge inroads. And in terms of changing security ideas, the idea that Trump himself has not said, but there have been people around who've talked about the idea of a new hemispheric policy in which America, the United States, looks north and south, but doesn't necessarily look east and west. Well, from the point of view of China, there's an idea, Xin Menglodui, which I'm sure you know, Anand, means new Monroeism, as in a new Monroe doctrine. When they heard those statements about manifold destiny in Donald Trump's inaugural, I think there were a lot of ears that suddenly pricked up very, very enthusiastically in Beijing.
Okay. Before I turn to you, Margaret, can I just say to our viewers, I'm not going to ask Margaret a question that's basically your book was really, really good. So don't vote for that question, please. But I've said it now, Margaret. They think your book was very good on the First World War. But over to you.
That's very nice. Thank you. I think it's a combination, isn't it? I mean, I think there were longer term changes happening. The growth of populism, the growing polarization in many countries between the left and the right, the culture wars, the large numbers of people who feel they've been left behind by whatever's happening. There's also been a longer term shift in the world, the growth of China, the domestic problems that a number of the developed countries have, developed economies have. But then you get someone like Trump, and I never underestimate the importance of individuals in history, especially if they wield a great deal of power. And Donald Trump has got his hands on the levers of the most powerful country in the world. And so it matters what he does. And so I think he is coasting on these longer term trends. I think he's benefited from them because he has managed to make himself the spokesperson of those who feel left behind and feel that they're being marginalized. It's curious because, I mean, what he's done is give a great deal of benefits, including tax breaks and a great deal of power to oligarchs. But he's still perceived as someone who can speak directly to the average American person. And where he takes this power is, I think, going to depend very much on him. He's not controllable by anyone. He's often not interested in certain issues, and he may leave those to the people he's appointed. But where he really cares, he will intervene very suddenly, very quickly. He'll use his social media to suddenly suggest a new direction. So I think we are living at a moment when a number of things are coming together. There is a longer term change. Where that longer term change is going to go now is going to depend, I think, partly on Donald Trump. And that's a terrifying prospect because he seems to me not to have a clear set of policies. He has certain things he likes and doesn't like. At the moment, Canada's one of the ones he doesn't like. But what he intends to do with the world, whether he has any sense of the damage he's doing, as Tim and others have said, it's absolutely extraordinary that you would turn on your allies and in ways that don't make sense. I mean, even great powers need allies, and yet he's turning on his allies. He doesn't seem to have any qualms about handing over Ukraine to the tender mercies of Russia, which I find extraordinary. So I think it's going to be, I think when we look back, when we reach a period of calm, which I hope we will one day, when we look back, I think we will see the Trump's second presidency, particularly, as a real moment of great change.
Tim?
You said epochal change, Anand. for which, of course, the German is Zeitenwende.
Yeah.
And I think we are in an epochal change, but not just since January the 20th, as Margaret said. At least for Europe, it's since the 24th of February 2022. That ended what I have called the post-wall period, the period that started with the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989 and goes to the beginning of the full-scale war in Ukraine. Others call it the post-Cold War period. And so now, we're in that beginning of a new period where nobody knows where it's going to go. But I think the drivers of it are twofold. I mean, the geopolitics, it's about Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, and Xi Jinping, but it's also about a world of transactional great powers. Modi's India, Erdogan's Turkey, Brazil, South Africa. And as you know, Anand, in the polling we did with ECFR, the European Council on Foreign Relations, we found that these countries like China are quite comfortable with this world of transactional great powers. And in a sense, what we're seeing is that Russia and China were already there, and now the United States, and this is the shocker, is joining that world of transactional great powers. And then at the same time, as always in history, you have these really longer term drivers like global warming, which surely has to be mentioned, and the internet and AI, which produces new sorts of uncertainty. So yes, epochal change, and I think it'll take some years before we can really begin to say where it's heading.
But it's also deeply political, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that struck me about JD Vance's speech at Munich was it wasn't just about sort of transactional foreign policy. It was about intervening very, very directly in the domestic politics of allies and fueling that sort of what Margaret called the culture war domestically as well. I mean, that slightly took me by surprise. I hadn't expected that at all. But what did you make of that? I mean, you first, Tim, I suppose, because it was Germany was one of the prime targets of that.
Listen, what nobody expected and what was so shocking at Munich was that JD Vance, instead of talking about Ukraine, which he didn't mention, literally didn't mention, made an election speech on behalf of the AfD, the hard right nationalist populist party, already running at more than 20% in the polls, a week before the German election. And then he didn't meet with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, but he met with the leader of the AfD, Alice Weidel. I mean, this is such a shocking development. And in a sense, what you're seeing is a battle of two Europes, right? We have what we might broadly call liberal Europe. We have anti-liberal Europe, the Europe of Marine Le Pen, Viktor Orban, Robert Fico, Kaczynski, Nigel Farage. And suddenly you have the whole weight of the US administration of the White House swinging behind that anti-liberal Europe at a time when these parties are doing spectacularly well in the polls. And by the way, the effect of all this has not been, as you might expect, and as I believe is happening in Canada, that sentiment goes back towards the liberal parties. Actually, the AfD is doing even better as a result because people say, well, look, if the world's richest man is supporting them and the world's most powerful man is supporting them, and these parties are coming to power everywhere, why shouldn't I vote for them?
But Trump himself isn't particularly popular in Germany, is he?
Well, he's not half as unpopular as in Britain or France,
Right.
But he is popular with the right.
Right.
Unlike with Marine Le Pen, who's been very, very restrained. But with
Yeah.
the AfD, they love him.
Yeah. So, Margaret, we should come to that now. I mean, it's having exactly the opposite effect in the polling in Canada in the Rochor election, isn't it? Which is quite interesting.
It's been extraordinary because Canada generally, and we tend to be down on ourselves. I mean, we are a sort of modest people. And when polls are done, Canadians say, oh, we're pretty hopeless and we're not a very good country and we don't take pride in the country. And the first poll done after Trump's inaugural speech, the number of Canadians who said they were proud of their country jumped by 10%, and it keeps going up. And I think we've surprised ourselves. I mean, there's real anger in Canada. I mean, we feel, been a good ally to the United States. We've worked with them, we trade with them. And this seems to us absolutely gratuitous. Of course, it's also going to, Trump is so curious because he appeals to the right, but he doesn't share many of the values of the right or policies of the right. I mean, he believes in protectionism, and a lot of the right believe in free trade. He's unpredictable on these things. And what he's doing will probably, in the long run, I think almost certainly damage the American economy. And again, damage the prospects of those who Trump claims to represent, the working men and women of the United States. But I know we have really shocked ourselves, I think. And it's very interesting. The leader of the Conservatives, Paul Poilievre, who has spent about 2 years saying Canada's a broken country and has been, gone down to Mar-a-Lago and kissed the ring and so on, is now suddenly doing a 180-degree return and trying to portray himself as a great Canadian patriot. Not very convincingly, I must say. So it has helped the Liberals.
I mean, sorry, Tim, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just quickly, it's in comment/question to Margaret. My Canadian friends, and indeed my numerous Canadian cousins, have been really disappointed in Britain. The lack of British solidarity, the lack of clear statements from the British government, who, after all, is Canada's part of the Commonwealth, the head of state is the king. And this strikes me very much how incredibly, to put it very kindly, cautious, to put it less kindly, craven, the British government has been in response to Trump. I mean, not a word about Canada being declared the 51st state, but also Munich was full of European politicians, notably German ones, making very strong statements about, we respect your democracy, you should respect ours. And by comparison, the Brits sounded like, I have to say, craven sycophants. And I think that's partly, it is partly an effect of Brexit, dare I say.
Yeah, well, they haven't said anything really as far as Canada is concerned, as far as I know. I don't think Starmer has barely mentioned the word. And I think that will not go down well in Canada. I mean, we've gradually been moving away from Britain anyway. We still have, of course, sentimental ties, but I think there really is a shock. And I think the idea, and I don't know, and if you want to get onto Britain now, but the idea that Britain can be a bridge between the United States and Europe, I think is absolute pipe dream. I think it's not a bridge that's going to last. I mean, Trump and co will just give it a kick one day. They don't believe in the special relationship. I mean, there may be people in Britain who still believe in it, but I think it certainly is not given any credibility in the United States, particularly by this administration.
But are you then, any of you, basically arguing that we should start thinking that that's, I mean, we can argue about whether the relationship is as special for both sides. It clearly isn't, but there is a very close military, security, intelligence relationship between the UK and the US. Are you arguing that actually we should just consider that a thing of the past now? That it's going to.
I think you've got to look at. Oh, sorry.
No, Margaret, go ahead.
I think you have to.
Okay.
You go ahead.
Sorry. Sorry about this. Well, just quickly. I mean, I think if the UK and the United States and Canada and Australia, New Zealand, members of the Five Eyes, but given what's going on in Washington, would you want to share intelligence with Washington at the moment? I think, yes, there is a security relationship, but how strong it is and how much it's going to last, I think is now one of the really big questions.
So no, I would always recommend people listen to Margaret rather than anything I have to say. So I would just come off on the back of that. I think one of the things which is already becoming evident, and it's not quite clear which way it's going to go, but I think it's there, is that the security priorities for the United States and for essentially, let's say Australia, New Zealand, and the Asia Pacific region are becoming very different from those of the UK and possibly Canada. So let me just explain what I mean by that. I think it's fair to say that there's been a very long turn, certainly since the so-called pivot of the Obama administration, which is now about 10, 15 years ago, towards the idea that the US is going to have to spend more of its time and resources and treasure, although hopefully not blood, in terms of shoring up American power in the Asia-Pacific region. So that could be the maintenance of the status quo over Taiwan. It could be defending former allies such as Japan and South Korea, or security partners such as Singapore, or even areas that technically are neutral but nonetheless need defending, like freedom of navigation operations. And there was some discussion during the defence and security review that took place under the previous British government as to how far, if at all, the relatively small UK presence in the Asia Pacific might be relevant to that. In fact, they came up with an answer, which is still actually one of the things that the Trump administration hasn't yet sought to overturn and may not do, and that's AUKUS, the Australia, UK, United States agreement on the provision of nuclear submarines for Australia. And one of the reasons, by the way, that I think that might last is that it does, unlike many of the defense agreements, which I think Tim indicated this, and he'll probably come back on it, and I think he's right, Europe is not yet getting its act together on. The AUKUS agreement does have something for everyone. The United States clearly gets a certain amount of the work, but also, of course, security presence and in a useful alliance. The UK gets work. Barrow in Furness, I think, is going to get a lot of the submarine work. And Australia gets technology it hasn't had before. The problem with that is that it makes the major European security concern, which is Russia, essentially irrelevant. Russia, for the moment, is not a big player in the world of the Asia Pacific. Of course, it is a Pacific power, and Japan, not least over the Kuril Islands dispute since World War II, has had issues. But I think it would be an exaggeration to say that right now Russia is a major security question in the region. It was during the Cold War, and it could become again, but that will change. So let me give my final thought and throw back on the question of Canada. Let's talk about the Arctic. We haven't mentioned Greenland yet, but let's get Greenland into the conversation because it has to do with the north part of North America. It has to do with Europe and Denmark. It has to do with China. Because, of course, underneath the language and the rhetoric about, taking over Greenland and, Denmark's going to have to get out of the way and it's for the free world, etc., it's notable that what Trump and those around him have done is to force what might be one of the biggest security issues of the next decade coming up, which is the question of the Arctic and where it sits. Now, previous powers, the US, Canada, Denmark, Scandinavian countries, would have sat in a quiet room with each other and discussed what's the best way to deal with the real issue of Russia and China wanting more of a security presence in the region. Now it's being done through a megaphone at the front of the room. And the question, my fellow panelists may have views on this, is how do you get to the real, and they are real security issues around the frozen, rapidly unfreezing far north, but not do it in such a way that allies are falling out with each other while the opponents of the liberal world are finding ways actually to get on mineral rights, to, passage for shipping, a much more easy passage.
I should add to that mineral rights are now part of the conversation about Ukraine as well under the Trump administration. But I suppose one question that comes from that I'd be interested in your views on is, okay, Trump has his own unique style of governing, but how much of what is happening reflects a more secular shift in what the US thinks and how the US sees the world? That is to say, it's incredibly abrupt under President Trump, but we can see signs of this direction of travel even under previous Democratic administrations. And is this just the way the US is going, albeit it's going there at full throttle now because of this president?
Do you want me to say something?
Always.
There's always been a strain of isolationism in the United States, and that I think is partly a result of geography, partly a result of the fact that the United States was born in an act of rebellion against Europe and saw itself as a different sort of society, not involved with the rest of the world. And geography has treated the United States very well. I mean, they've had much weaker powers on their borders. They have those two huge oceans. And so I think what is surfacing again is a long-standing isolationism. But the world has changed so much that I just don't think it's sustainable. I mean, even if you're in Kansas, in the middle of the United States, you are not safe from intercontinental ballistic missiles, much less from supersonic missiles. That increasingly the United States, like the rest of the world, is part of one world, and the weapons make that even more the case. And so I think those Americans who dream of pulling up the drawbridge and letting the rest of the world do what it wants are dreaming, and they also need things from the rest of the world. And what I find extraordinary is, yes, they need, one of the interests in the Arctic is as the Arctic melts, there'll be things like rare earths, various minerals that will be very important. And China and Russia are both a threat, I think, to the far north. But that's when I think the United States needs allies instead of threatening them. I just find the Trump policy so incoherent and so unproductive for the United States. I can't believe there's a coherent purpose behind it. It seems to me just to be based on emotion and whim and last moment sort of changes of ideas.
I mean, there are a lot of people out there trying to discern some hidden strategy to all of this. So you're basically just saying that this is just impulsive.
It strikes me as very impulsive. I mean, Trump announces policies by tweet, and he allows people like Elon Musk to speak for him, and doesn't contradict them. He sends out contradictory messages. Greenland is a fixation of his. The United States already has everything it wants in Greenland. I mean, it has bases there. It's had them since the Second World War. It has access to the minerals. Yes, they should be worrying about China, but they would be better off, I would suggest, cooperating with Greenland. I mean, there is an independence movement there. It may eventually become independent from Denmark, and signing treaties with it, offering to undertake its defense. As it happens, I mean, what they've done is as it's happened, and what the United States has done is alienate, I think, not just the people of Greenland, but also alienate Denmark, alienate a number of democracies around the world because of the bullying.
I'm actually heading down to Washington, D.C. in a couple of hours' time to the Council on Foreign Relations, which, of course, is one of the places where the great and the good of D.C., discuss all of these matters. I think it's fair to say that as yet, very few people who are deeply involved with the foreign policy world, which has always tended in some areas to be quite bipartisan in various ways. Sorry, my screen is doing something funny here. Bipartisan in various ways. To discern what the direction of travel actually is. If you think about someone like the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, it's fascinating because actually he's always been regarded as, something of a traditional neocon, actually, Republican-style hawk. He wouldn't have been perhaps out of place in the George W. Bush administration. And yet, in various things, it's clear that he's having to adapt to what's a very fast-changing environment. If you take the Middle East, the announcement of the policy that Trump put forward that Gaza was somehow going to be taken over and turned into a holiday resort. I mean, whether this is actually practical in any meaningful sense, I think, is very hard to discern. But it's clear that in some ways the State Department is having to sort of work on the hoof to adjust itself to what's happening in terms of the speed of change. There's no sign of that whatsoever slowing down in the first 4 weeks that we're talking about here now. Whether it slows down in 4 months, let alone 4 years, is another question. All revolutions eventually, have a limited amount of energy that they can expend. But right now, it appears that there is plenty of fuel in the tank. And I would expect that Gaza announcement, the Greenland announcement, these are by no means the last of these things that we're going to hear.
I heard one term used the other day to describe everyone madly trying to make sense of what Trump is saying: sane washing. After whitewashing and greenwashing, sane washing. And there clearly is a high level of incoherence. But just 3 quick comments. First of all, I think it's really important to say that the trend that Rana was alluding to, namely declining US interest in Europe and a declining priority for Europe, is one that runs throughout the post-Cold War period. Right? I mean, it was obscured under the Clinton administration and to some extent under Biden, because Biden was an old Atlanticist, emphasis on old. But it is a secular trend. It was very clear under the Obama administration, so it's just been turbocharged under Trump.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, we as Britain should try and get on well with the US as well as with Europe. But I think the hallmark of our international policy for the last 10 years has also been incoherence. Right? I mean, we say Brexit, we're going to be independent, sovereign, free, nimble, seizing opportunities in emerging markets, India, Asia, etc., and so forth. And where are we 10 years later? Saying we're going to lead the defense of Europe by putting British soldiers on the River Dnipro, if not on the River Don. We're going to lead the defense of Europe. Right, but at the same time being incredibly cautious about the economic relationship with Europe. So that seems to me incoherent. Third point, and again to what Rana said, if you are going to play a leading role in the defense of Europe, including being prepared to put a brigade, that's about 5,000 men, into peacekeeping force in Ukraine, which actually means you have to have 15,000 dedicated to the task. Are you seriously thinking you're going to be able to make a major contribution to naval security in the Asia Pacific, in the Taiwan Strait, with our 2 aircraft carriers, so that there were some real hard choices, both, I think, between the US of Trump and Europe, but also between, as it were, a sense of global Britain and the idea that we're going to be a major player in European security.
Okay, well, hold that thought. I am going to come back to UK foreign policy. There's a specific question for Rana I want to put to him, and a big question I want to put to the three of you, because I know Rana's got to leave in about 15 minutes to go and teach. The specific question, Rana, is given how much emphasis there was on China in the run-up to the Trump's election, isn't it rather strange that one of his actions, which is the slashing of USAID, might just open the door to greater Chinese influence throughout the world?
At one level, yes, absolutely. And I think it's clear that USAID over time has been an immense soft power tool that the United States has used very, very effectively on everything from disease prevention to development more broadly defined. And it's been very useful because if you look at the detail of the way in which USAID has worked over the decades compared to, say, the Belt and Road Initiative, the famous infrastructure wave, you might put it, of funding that China sponsored in the 2010s. Actually, most of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is really loans, often on not entirely favourable terms, but nonetheless sometimes better than others. It's neither the kind of debt diplomacy completely that some people have said, nor is it simply a kind of altruistic gift to the world, as Beijing has sometimes put out. It's more in between. But much of USAID is basically actually donations or the provision of a tremendous amount of developmental assistance, essentially, on the taxpayer dollar in the US. So it is something that has cost US taxpayers a great deal. But I would personally say that what they've gained in terms of gaining a calmer world, and one in which the United States' reputation has been much higher, has reaped them the benefit on many, many occasions. Will it make a great deal of difference now? I think it is already making a difference. I was speaking to a significant policymaker from Pakistan the other day, last week, who said that in Islamabad, for instance, an example of that kind of middle power that is really going to be one of the swing states, you might say, of the coming decade, they are finding it very difficult to work out what the direction of travel is in the United States. If there's not going to be any more development assistance with USAID, if there isn't a clear set of policies about what the geopolitics means related to China, then wouldn't it just be simpler, at least some people are saying, not everyone, but some, to go lean into the Chinese side, not on the grounds that the Chinese are altruistic or have the good of Pakistan or Indonesia or Bangladesh or any of these countries in mind, but rather that right now, if you sign an agreement with China, you probably know what you're getting. You might be getting very heavy interest rate. You might get all sorts of pressure to favor Chinese businesses, but you kind of know that up front. And right now, knowing what the upfront offer is from the United States, what does it mean to cooperate with the United States? This is something that's now in the last 2, 3, 4 weeks become a question to which there is no clear answer in a way which, since 1961, which I think when John F. Kennedy founded the predecessor of USAID, has been something that has been, I think, fairly clearly stated and understood as an American-backed proposition. That proposition appears no longer to be there.
Yeah, and we'll come back to this. We will do Britain towards the end about how we should regard the US. Is it still... Tim, do you want to come in on this point?
Just a couple of sentences, just to add, since we're on aid. Of course, the largest aid donor in the world is the EU. And a student of mine did a very interesting study, a Chinese student, on EU aid, European aid donations, showing that it's now quite consciously tracking and to some extent countering Chinese aid donation. So I guess to pick up on what Rana said, if there's all this uncertainty about whether USAID exists and what the terms would be, there's another major player there, which is the EU with its enormous aid budgets now being used more politically.
Okay, I'm very excited about this because I couldn't imagine three people to whom I'd rather put this question that has come up a lot, which is, are we effectively back in the 1930s? Go on then, historians. Let's talk analogies. Who wants to go first? Margaret, I'm going to pick on you.
I was going to defer to Rana because I also know he has to go to a class. The analogy is always tricky because you can get caught by them, and they're not yeah, they're not absolute, but I am thinking more and more about the 1930s, but I'm also thinking about the period before 1914, when you also had new powers emerging and not always apparently helping their own interests. And I think the 1930s are very worrying. And you had that, I think appeasement has, I think, unfairly been attacked as being just weak need. It was an honorable attempt to avoid another world war. And at the same time, to his credit, Neville Chamberlain, for example, was beginning to up British defense spending so that Britain was better prepared by the time the war finally broke out. But it is, I think, the disregard of the rights of small nations, which you got with Czechoslovakia, and then you got, of course, with the Nazi-Soviet pact to divide up the center of Europe, is something I think we're going to see again. The fact that Ukraine will be discussed in Saudi Arabia by representatives from the US and Russia, but no Ukrainians, it seems to me it's sending a message to smaller powers that you just don't count anymore. And I think that is dangerous. And again, as we know from the 1930s, the power of example is very important. Mussolini got away with invading Ethiopia. Hitler got away with moving troops into the Rhineland. He got away with Anschluss, absorbing Austria into Germany. And that simply encouraged others to try and get away. And as the Japanese got away with taking over Manchuria. And I think we will see more powerful nations or regional powers trying to extend their influence, if necessary, seizing land. I mean, there are so many territorial disputes in the world that if people wish, they could reactivate. So I think we are looking at previous turbulent periods in history, not the same necessarily as today. I mean, what is different, for example, Tim mentioned climate change. I mean, we are facing an existential crisis as a species, and AI, I think, is going to pose a challenge to what it means to be human. So we have different sets of problems. We have different types of communications, different kinds of weapons. Our capacity to destroy ourselves is much greater than it was in the 1930s or even during the Cold War. But yes, there are very uncomfortable parallels at the moment.
So I'm going to give, if I may, three reasons why it's not the same as 1930. I mean, I think I'd agree with everything that Margaret has put up there is really important, but just to provide contrasts. Number one, the 1930s, in the end, was marked by a deeply flawed but very powerful liberal hegemon, which was the United States under the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Today, I think I'm going to push a little bit here. Feel free to push back, other friends and panelists. I don't think there is a liberal hegemon anymore. At least it's not easy to see what it is. It's not the EU, because the EU, as we know, can project certain types of economic power. It cannot project security power in the kind of classic military sense. The United States can do that. China can do that. Certain other middle-level powers can do it, at least regionally. But we are now living in a very, very unusual world. Maybe it's, I mean, Margaret talked about pre-1914. Maybe this is pre-1815, and pre-Waterloo, Napoleonic world. I mean, again, President Trump has echoed Emperor Napoleon just the other day when he said, yesterday, I think, when he said, "He who breaks the law he who saves his country breaks no law," which I think is a Napoleon quote, if I remember correctly. So a world with no liberal hegemon is different from the 1930s, where the United States made a huge difference. The second reason is that the role of Asia is very different. It's not just that the major Asian hegemon is China, not Japan this time, but I think the role itself is different. First, China is a rising power. It has tremendous military power, but again, I'm going to stick my neck out here. I don't think that the necessity for China to use its military power is going to be evident in the way that Japan, for its own reasons, decided that it would exercise military power in invading Manchuria and much of the rest of the world. China's geoeconomic power, its institutional power in the US, UN, and other major, global forums, is such that it can, I think, keep its huge military power essentially in abeyance, and take advantage of the changing global situation to exercise much more influence. Technology would be another area, essentially, where it creates path dependency for itself. So I think that element is very different. The final thing is that the rest of the world, the non-European world, matters in terms of its agency much more than it did in the 1930s. For in the 1930s, Japan's agency, of course, mattered, but it was exceptional that way. These days, I think it's fair to say that, I put it this way, Ukraine's not at the table in Saudi Arabia. But the fact that the meeting is happening in Saudi Arabia, not somewhere in Europe, I think is very interesting. And number two, I don't know if there's some informal presence there, but if Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, phoned up Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump and said, "I want to be there," I think he would have a ticket, sent to him, within seconds. There's no question that the Chinese would be allowed in. And second, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but I think it's extremely unlikely that Moscow and Beijing are not talking to each other about what's happening in Riyadh, about Europe. And that's an exact reversal of the way that Asia was carved up back in the 1930s.
Interesting. Tim?
Um, so obviously, this is always about the similarities and the differences. For all the differences with the 1930s, I think the 1938 counterfactual is very relevant. So the counterfactual from autumn 1938 is that Britain and France had stood by Czechoslovakia, which, let me remind you, had won a strong army, formidable fortifications precisely in the Sudetenland, and one of the most impressive defense industries in Europe at that time. The balance of military advantage, and we know this from the German documents, would have been very, very different if we had taken a stand at that point rather than a year later with the guarantee to Poland. And there, I think the analogy in relation to Ukraine today, which has the most formidable army, which is producing incredible resistance, which increasingly has a remarkable defense industry producing 1.5 million drones a year, is very relevant. Second point, on the global scale, I think the closest analogy is the late 19th, early century Europe writ large. That said, it seems to be plausible to see countries not just like China and Russia, but also India and Turkey, behaving like late 19th century European great powers and empires.
Mm.
They are, if you like, Palmerstonian, Lord Palmerston. Britain has no eternal friends, just eternal interests. So we calmly pursue our national interests. We'll switch allies if need be, but that's what we're about. But the difference, as Rana said, is that this is now on a global scale. It's in a post-Western world, and many of these great powers are now non-Western powers, and that's why it doesn't have to end in 1914.
Interesting. Thank you. I want to come back to the UK, which is nominally at least the subject we were meant to be talking about today. And I detect in the room, the virtual room, a degree of skepticism about the ability of Keir Starmer to act as that bridge between Europe and the United States. But surely it is absolutely bleeding obvious that he should try. I mean, it might end up failing, but surely he's doing the right thing by trying. That is, in his shoes, that's the logical first play, isn't it?
Well, can't we think of a better metaphor? I mean, Anand, as you know better than any of us, this has been the kind of master metaphor of British foreign policy for the last 50 years. I mean, the Blair years were full of
Yeah.
talk of the bridge, right? But we're clearly in a much, much weaker position to do it than we were 15, 20 years ago, when we had strong relations both with the Anglosphere and as a member state of the European Union, and by the way, quite good relations with China too, subject to correction by Rana. So the problem with this image is, in my view, not the noun, but the definite article. Yeah? I mean, of course, we can be a bridge, but not the bridge, because there's a German bridge, a French bridge, a Polish bridge, an Italian bridge. I mean, Giorgia Meloni, personally, is much better placed to woo and win Trump over Ukraine than Keir Starmer is. And so I think it's a dangerous illusion to think that that is sort of speak fundamentally our global role.
Rana, I know you've got to go in a sec. Did you want to come in on this before you did?
Yeah, just briefly. And I think, again, I would agree with Tim that trying to find, I mean, I would agree with both of you. Trying to find a role, I think, is not an unworthy or unreasonable thing to do, particularly at a time when things are changing. It will be necessary for states that have some stake in the global order to do something to stabilize it. That said, I think that the search for allies, the search for partners, has become much more urgent than it was even, it was already urgent, but I think, even compared to a few months ago, there is a new sense of urgency there as well. Let me just throw in a thought here. I mean, I think it's probably to my last one. My apologies, run off and talk about what happened in China in 1945 at the end of World War II when it joined the United Nations to my students. Again, seems rather sort of poignant in some ways. But let me make my final thought a China one, if I may. If we look at some of the areas which are actually going to decide the fate of economies and societies the next 10 years, think about technology and standards. What does the current shift in terms of global politics mean for a country like the UK, which wants, for instance, to have a primary role in AI, which wants to have manufacturing capacity in electric vehicles and to use battery technology, much of which comes from China, and to also be at the forefront, as the US does not, of a net zero energy transition? Every single element of what I've mentioned points towards dealing with Chinese technology. That's not meant to be a statement of favorability, just a statement of fact. And in this rapidly changing world, I do find myself wondering, well, let me leave this thought with my comrades here, whether some of the turn may not be about being a bridge towards the United States, but actually towards being a bridge towards the use of Chinese technology. And in doing that, putting forward a whole variety of really tough dilemmas about how you do that in terms of economic prosperity, but deal with the very real security considerations that necessarily and obviously also obtain when you are engaging closely in areas that are sensitive, like technology, with China.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rana, and thank you for making the time before a morning class to do this. Margaret, any thoughts on this idea of a bridge? I think Keir Starmer tried to change the metaphor, but he ended up saying we're halfway between Europe and the United States, which just sounded a little bit wet, to be honest. I mean, we're just in the middle of the sea, so no one's
we used
to one.
to have a Canadian one that we're the middle of the dumbbell, one end in the US and one end in Europe. Whether that made us a dumbbell as well, I don't know. But I think you can wish for what you want, and I think it's middle powers, which Canada and I suppose Britain increasingly have to have strategies and have to have policies, and trying to keep contact with great powers, I think, is very important. I think always the danger with Trump, and again, I come back to the fact that he's president, not someone else. Others might react differently, but Trump, I think, respects those who stands up to him. His tendency is to bully. And if you try and conciliate him and flatter him, and flattery, I think, is okay. But if you try and conciliate him, you try and give way, I'm not sure you actually win. And that's the problem. I mean, the sort of people Trump seems to does respect, are people like Putin, whom he can't push around. And I do think that's a worry. And I think, I hope people are reflecting somewhere in the Trump administration that the United States is a great military power, but its power is not as absolute as it used to be. I think it has real problems. It has real problems recruiting for its military. There've been articles recently about the shortfalls in the military. They have problems getting people who can be trained adequately. They're finding they have to do an awful lot of education, even physical fitness. And the lead that the Chinese, or at least the great steps the Chinese seem to be taking on artificial intelligence, I mean, the recent step they took, is worrying people in the United States. And this is not a moment for the United States to start mucking around with its security establishment, which is precisely what it's doing. And I think, if I were in the United States, I would be worrying again about the sort of leadership that is being presented from Washington. But as far as Britain goes, I think, you've got a difficult road to walk along. But if you give way too much, you'll lose it and you won't gain anything. Tim will know much more about this than me. I'd really like to hear what he says about it.
So I mean, I saw our new ambassador to Washington, one Peter Mandelson, being quoted the other day saying, we've got to find a way to have our cake and eat it. That may sound familiar to some of you who remember Boris Johnson. And I'm afraid, I mean, obviously it makes sense to try to have good relations with the US and with the EU and with China. But as we've all been saying, at a certain point, there are going to be hard choices. I mean, to pick up on what Rana said, how delighted is Washington going to be if we're the gateway for Chinese green energy technology in partnership with Chinese AI? I mean, come off it. But by the same token, if we get a good deal on tariffs, namely being let off most of them by Washington, while he's hammering the EU with tariffs, our European partners are going to say, hey, well, you're talking about a great reset with the EU. You're talking about being fully involved in European security. You want us to give you defense contracts from EU procurement money, and meanwhile, you're off making this special deal with Donald Trump. So I hope people in Whitehall are thinking rather carefully about what happens when you actually come to those moments of choice.
Do you think it's as brutal as that, that basically Starmer faces a choice? You either choose Europe or you choose the United States. I mean,
No, I don't. No, I don't, Anand. I think that's far too simplistic. And I'm not sure what choosing Europe would mean, since nobody in British politics, to my knowledge, or almost nobody, is talking about rejoining the EU, and almost nobody in the EU is talking about Britain
Mhm.
rejoining. So I don't know quite what that would mean. I mean, it could mean, for example, saying, yes, economically, we're going to look for, say, dynamic alignment with EU regulations as they change, and a genuinely closer economic relationship, so that our security and economic priorities, in a sense, align. I mean, that could make sense. But I don't think it's going to be a simple, black or white, all or nothing choice. But I think there will be choices in the plural.
But you are saying there's a trade-off in the sense that if we strike some sort of sweetheart deal with the US over tariffs, that will be reflected in a changing EU attitude, as in
I
they.
think that's right. I don't think we can imagine getting a really good reset and getting, that our shopping list of things we want from the EU, at the same time as doing that and being seen as, because we have to understand, and Anand, you know this very well, just how deep the trauma of Brexit still is for our European partners and friends. I mean, Angela Merkel, in her memoirs, talks about a sense of betrayal. And that's a word I've heard quite often from European friends. So this would be seen as another act of betrayal, I'm afraid. And emotions matter.
So, Margaret, I mean, Keir Starmer is going to head off to Washington. I don't think it's this week anymore. I think it's later this month. Do you think I mean, a fool's errand is putting it strongly, but do you think he can come away with, or he can persuade President Trump to sort of water down his position on Ukraine a little bit? Or do you think he's basically wasting his time?
No, I think he has to try. And I think he has to deal with President Trump, because in the end, if Trump is interested in something, or if I sometimes think he's like a searchlight and his interest will suddenly fall on something. It's unpredictable, but you have to be prepared for that. And he will have the final word if it's a subject that interests him. And so you have to try and deal with him. And Trump is both transactional. I think he also believes in personal relationships.
Mm.
And of course, Keir Starmer has to go to Washington, has to try and deal with him. But again, I think he has to be very careful, because if he is seen to be browbeaten by Trump, and Trump is capable of doing that publicly, capable of tweeting about it, if he's seen to have sided with the US against the rest of Europe in any particular way, I think it will hurt Britain a great deal. And as Tim says, I mean, I think perhaps the British don't realize, and I think it's a very good point, just how deeply affected the Europeans were by Brexit, and how much it concerned them. And so I do think it's a very difficult dance, and you're going to need very good diplomats, and you're going to need to pay a great deal of attention to it. And it's the unpredictability, I think, which is going to affect every power in the world that has to deal with the United States, because it's not, you can't say it's going in a particular direction. You can see certain trends, but given the nature of the president, it's quite likely that he will change his mind, or he'll try something else. That's what I think people have to be ready to deal with.
Yeah. Can I say something, Anand, because we're coming to the end, about Ukraine, because we haven't talked
I was
specifically.
about to come to it, so yes, do.
Well, do you want to ask a question, or shall I
Well,
just?
I mean, I was going to say, you wrote in your latest column, you were talking about the need for Europeans to step up to the plate and, carry their fair share of the burden, which is significantly more than they have to date in Ukraine. And I was going to ask you whether you thought that was a realistic possibility. I think you and I have chatted offline about this. I'm a little bit skeptical that the Europeans will.
So this is one of the things where we can, I think, at least I at least feel we can be proud of what Britain has done, because we were there from even before the beginning of the full-scale war. And if you go to Ukraine, as I've done many times, you know, it's one of the few places in the world where it's really nice still to be British, because there's enormous gratitude, and the UK anti-tank missiles and so on, all of that. But I think this conversation, Anand, has now got off on very much the wrong foot, because we had this brief moment of European unity at the Munich Security Conference, emergency meeting in Paris yesterday, and what's the news story today? Europe is divided. Europe is divided on a completely unrealistic proposition that we should be a peacekeeping force after there has been a peace agreed by Russia and Ukraine, and with a US security guarantee. Those are two things that are not going to happen anytime soon. I cannot see any explicit peace deal to which both Putin and Zelensky are going to put their signature. I don't think that exists. So you're not going to have a peace. You might have a ceasefire, but that's something very different. And Trump is sure as hell not going to give a security guarantee. So we are divided over this completely unrealistic hypothetical instead of doing what we could do, Anand, to your question, which is say, how are we going to enable the Ukrainians to continue to fight and stabilize the crumbling front line in the East, even without US military and economic support? And I would say that is realistic in the sense that we've got the kit and we've got the money to do it. Is it realistic in the sense of, do we have the political will, and can the different governments get their act together? There I would have much bigger doubts, but that's a realistic conversation. What can we do to help Ukraine to keep defending itself for the next however many months it takes, while Trump and Putin are off talking in Saudi Arabia and Moscow and Washington, right? But that's not actually going to be the peace deal, because it's not going to be accepted by Ukraine or Europe. And then how do we map a course from that defense support to credible deterrence? Because it's not going to be one of those great peace conferences of the kind that Margaret has written about so beautifully. It's going to be more like what happened after the Korea War, or actually after the Second World War, a de facto kind of frozen conflict that turns into a line of division, with us having to do active deterrence for years and probably decades to come.
Okay, Margaret, did you want to come in on this at all?
No, just to say I agree with what Tim says. I think it's completely unrealistic to think that there's going to be some sort of European peacekeeping force. But what I do think, if I can take a slightly optimistic note before we all leave completely depressed, is that what has happened in the sort of series of crises of the last few weeks is that a great many countries and a great many people have been forced to think about what they think is important, what they think they should be doing about it. I mean, I think in Europe and in Canada too, because the United States was so dominant in NATO and so dominant in the Western Alliance, we got used to letting it decide everything. And we realized we can't do that anymore. And that may actually be a moment when we start to grow up again.
I think that's exactly right. And one key to that, Margaret, is going to be Germany. Because
And
Germany is Europe's central power. They've got an election coming up, so there is a new beginning. And if Germany really changed its approach and started stepping up to the plate together with British and France, then you might begin to have a credible European defense identity in the way we haven't really since 1945.
now, I mean, obviously, we don't know what sort of government we're going to get in Germany or how long it's going to take them to get it. But would you anticipate a CDU-led government being an easier partner for those sorts of conversations than the current government?
I don't know if you're prepared to bet against Friedrich Merz being Chancellor, but I would take a quite large bet. I'll bet you a magnum of champagne on air, Anand, that Friedrich Merz will be the next Chancellor. But the key question is, what kind of coalition? Because what we saw
Yeah.
in the last 3 years is that a three-party coalition, such as we had, the so-called traffic light, was really dysfunctional in a country which has already so much divided power and almost too many checks and balances. So the key question is, can it be a two-party coalition, right? Will the arithmetic allow that? And then it's either Christian Democrats and Social Democrats or Christian Democrats and Greens, probably the former. But either of those could, I think, form quite a strong, credible government.
And of course, the frightening thought, I suppose, is that post-election, if the AfD genuinely do come in second, then we'll hear more noises off from Washington about firewalls and the like.
Well, and to end, I mean, again, in a kind of, I don't know if this is optimistic or pessimistic note, I think, I don't know if you'd agree, but both of you, but I think in all our politics, it's sort of a sense of the liberal mainstream drinking in the last chance saloon, right?
Mm.
If the liberal mainstream doesn't deliver in France in the next 2 years, the next president of France is probably going to be called Marine Le Pen. If the liberal mainstream doesn't deliver in Britain in the next 3 years, Reform UK may at least do quite spectacularly well, might replace the Conservative Party. If the liberal mainstream does not deliver in Germany, the AfD might win the next election in Germany. So I think that's just how big the stakes are.
And presumably, Margaret, even if the sort of centre left do quite well in Canada in this election, the same thing applies. You need to deliver.
Yeah, and I think we can count on, if the centre left wins, it can count on Canadian patriots supporting it, and we seem to be growing, and there seems to be a real feeling growing in Canada. But they do have to deliver, and we're going to face economic difficulties. The American tariffs are going to hit us very hard. Of course, they're going to hit the Americans too, but that's maybe not felt for a while, and the Americans may not realize where their economic problems are coming from. But I think, yes, I think we've got to, and some of the underlying discontent with the Liberals is still going to be there. And so they're going to have to deal with that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that lies in the economics, about which we've got a couple of events coming up in the near future. But we have now run out of time. So thank you ever so much, both of you. That was absolutely fascinating. We could have done another hour quite easily, but you should go off and enjoy Uruguay, Margaret. Thank you for your time, both of you. It's really nice to see you, and I'll hopefully see you both in person before too long. And that's it from us. Thank you all for tuning in. And